So this is a response video to a video called Are Seed Oils Inflammatory on the YouTube channel Nutrition Made Simple by a guy called Gil Carvalho, if I have his name right. A friend sent it to me and I watched it and I had some thoughts, and so this is my thoughts about the video. In the first part of the video, I'm going to talk about the double standard. So he made a video about saturated fat, and he has this very specific set of standards that he applies when he's looking at studies about saturated fat. So I'm going to talk about what those standards are and about when he talks about studies about pufas and about linoleic acid and about seed oils, he drops those standards. So he has a totally different standard for seed oil studies compared to saturated fat studies. So I think that's interesting. And even given those low standards, within the studies that he talks about, there's some disquieting evidence for seed oils potentially causing inflammation, even though he's saying that they don't. In the next section, I'm going to talk about a really interesting study. He actually brings it up, and it has to do with interactions between your genetics and the seed oils that you eat. So it's in this gene called delta 6 desaturase, or D6D, which is involved in converting linoleic acid to arachidonic acid and then ultimately into these oxylipins, which are oxidized fats. And so D6D is the rate limiting enzyme. So when you eat linoleic acid, the whole reason that it's presumably bad is that it gets converted to arachidonic acid and then oxylipins. And these oxylipins are signaling molecules, and they are involved in inflammation, and they're also involved in lipid metabolism because they signal things like PPAR alpha and PPAR gamma and the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. And so that part of the video, we're going to use a common variation in that D6D gene to see how that affects oxylipins and to see how that affects risks of inflammatory diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis. And then we're going to see what that can tell us about what happens when we eat linoleic acid in our diet. Is there any difference if we increase it, or is it all just based on whether or not you have good or bad genes? So I think that's really interesting. And then the final part of the video, don't miss this, buckle up. We're going to talk about the reality of restaurant fryers. In the video, he, in an offhand way, references something about reheated oils. There's not a lot of data in human trials, but he says something like, oh, I hear this is what they do in some of those fast food restaurants. That's not at all true. He's never worked in a restaurant kitchen. Clearly, all restaurants, all the time, reheat the oil for weeks and then feed it to you. So stay tuned for that part of the video. We're going to talk about what happens to those oils, how we know that they're on the fryers for weeks and weeks, and then what happens to those oils during that process. Buckle up.
So if seed oils are not pro-inflammatory, where does this idea come from? I mean, it's so pervasive, it's all over the internet. Linoleic acid can be converted to another fat called arachidonic acid, which can then be converted into a number of molecules that can play an inflammatory role. So that's the basis for this idea. So it would make sense. And examines the entire arachidonic acid metabolome. So all the molecules that get produced from it. One finds a constellation of metabolites. So a bunch of different molecules. Some are pro-inflammatory, some are anti-inflammatory. The net impact on human metabolism is virtually impossible to predict.
So one of my favorite quotes that he reads out of the literature, it says that when you look at the entire arachidonic acid metabolome, and that means all of these oxidized, these oxylipins, these oxidized things that arachidonic acid becomes, he says some are pro-inflammatory, but some are anti-inflammatory. The net impact on human metabolism is virtually impossible to predict. And he provides that as evidence that probably seed oils are fine. They're not pro-inflammatory. Well, and what he actually says is we have to test it. But, he's using that as evidence that just because these oxylipins are involved in inflammation doesn't necessarily mean that if we convert a bunch of linoleic acid to oxylipins, it doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be inflammation. The fact is, no one knows what's going to happen. And so, and I think that sets up a really interesting conversation about kind of people like Gill, and of course there's lots of them, right? They're essentially representing the view that, well, seed oils have been in the diet for a while now, and they're sort of globally accepted as part of the food system, and therefore they should be seen as sort of innocent until they're proven guilty. And so therefore, and so he's saying, well, and so these things are going to become oxylipins, and literally no one knows what's going to happen, and so they're fine. That doesn't prove guilt. My perspective is different. My perspective is, well, seed oils were actually introduced to the human diet during my parents' lifetime. Not that long ago. I'm the first generation. I'm Gen Zero of seed oils, right? And I don't have kids, but my friends and my family, they have kids who are 20. And so that's sort of like seed oil generation 1, right? Like they grew up raised by parents who ate seed oils, and they ate seed oils growing up. And so to me, the seed oils are a very new part of the human diet. That's my perspective, right? And so when I read this comment of, these lipoxins, as they call them, it can be inflammatory, but they do all kinds of things, and the net impact on human metabolism is virtually impossible to predict. I think, well, maybe that's grounds for concern. Maybe we should think about that and sort of pause on that for a minute, because what in my mind is a very new addition to the diet, we know, is involved in producing all these oxylipins, and we know that the effects of that are virtually impossible to predict. But nonetheless, we introduced them. And in America in 1960, we were eating 15 grams of soybean oil a day. Now that number is 60. Some of it's wasted, of course, so maybe it's really, 45 that we actually eat, or 40, but we eat a lot, and that number has increased greatly over time, despite the fact that the net impact on human metabolism is virtually impossible to predict. And so linoleic acid is converted to arachidonic acid by enzymes called D6D is the first one, and the second one is called D5D. D6D is really the rate-limiting enzyme that controls the conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is mostly found in cell membranes, and it's released from cell membranes by another enzyme called phospholipase A2, often called PLA2. And really interesting story about PLA2 is that bee venom, a bee stings you, you get inflamed, pain. So bee venom is a compound, most of what's in bee venom is a compound that actually activates the enzyme PLA2. And that PLA2 releases a bunch of arachidonic acid from your membranes, and then those arachidonic acids get converted into oxylipins, 12-HEAT and 9-HODE and all the others. And it's those oxylipins that is setting off the chain of event that's causing that pain and inflammation due to the bee sting.
So let's get to the real stuff. Next up, we have canola oil. And canola is high in monounsaturated fats, kind of like olive oil. And it's about 18% linoleic acid. And with canola, I start to see a lot of controversy and a lot of people scared of it and asking if it's inflammatory.
And so a buddy actually sent this video over to me, and I watched it. And one of the things that jumped out at me was, upon first watching, is how low quality most of the studies that he references are. And what I mean by that is often they're just giving people like, okay, so here's the study. It's like, okay, well, we told people to eat a tablespoon of soybean oil or a tablespoon of canola oil every day. We gave them the jugs of oil, sent them home, and then they came back in 2 months later, and we measured their CRP. CRP is a blood measure of inflammation. People do it very commonly. I think inflammation is a very complicated topic. I don't think that a simple measurement of CRP really does it justice, but it's an easy thing to measure. That's why people do it. So, fine, whatever. But anyway, so they give people some soybean oil, or they give them canola oil, and they send them home, and then they come back in a month or 2 months later, and they do another check of their CRP, and then you can say one is pro-inflammatory or not. But the problem with most of these studies is they don't check the baseline diet of the people. So when you give one group the soybean oil and you give the other group canola oil, you don't know if their canola oil or soybean oil consumption is going up or down because you don't know what they were eating before. Furthermore, presumably if they're going to eat soybean oil, they're going to swap it out with whatever they were cooking with before. And if you don't know that, well then, maybe they were already cooking with soybean oil, right? So if people come in and they do all the cooking with soybean oil, and then you're like now cooking soybean oil and see if your CRP levels change. And if you don't measure that, you have no idea, right? And so this is a common problem in many of these studies. So I'm going to show you some video of Gil talking about saturated fat, because when it comes to the topic of saturated fat, Gil is very aware of all of these issues, and he's going to explain what the S-curve is, how it works. He's going to explain that you absolutely have to know if you give someone an oil, you have to know what it's replacing to be able to draw any conclusions. And he's going to say that you need to have baseline data for everyone. Obviously, you have to have baseline data if you know what the thing is going to replace anyway.
That the effect of saturated fat on cardiovascular disease is shaped like an S. So what this means is that as the level of saturated fat intake rises, initially not much happens to risk, and then suddenly at one point the risk shoots up, and then it just stays high and not much happens again as the level of saturated fat intake rises more. So when we look at a population at large and we don't specify replacement, we tend to not see much change in risk with different saturated fat intake. So this knowledge changed the standard of the field. We now understand that just looking at changes in saturated fat in a vacuum is uninformative. We have to look at specific swaps, specific replacements. Was it already super high at baseline? Was it low? Did it increase significantly on either of the groups? This trial doesn't answer that.
So you can see when it comes to saturated fat, he has a very well thought out set of principles. But since this paper is about pufa, and since pufa, the idea that pufa is inflammatory just comes from rumors on the internet, he drops all pretense of standards. So now he's going to, completely without irony, present this Iranian paper. In this paper, they just give people canola oil, and they're like, eat this, and they don't present any data about the baseline polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fat consumption. They just give people canola oil. You have no idea what it's substituting for. You have no idea what goes up, what goes down, what changes. And then he completely misrepresents the findings of the paper.
So in this trial, people were asked to add 1 tablespoon a day of canola oil to their food for 2 months. And CRP, C-reactive protein, was not significantly different after the exposure to canola oil. Another real... Was it already super high at baseline? Was it low? Did it increase significantly on either of the groups? This trial doesn't answer that.
Exactly. So he says there's no significant difference. But in fact, I'm looking at the paper right now. There's 2 groups of people in this study. Remember, the study isn't testing canola oil, and it's not testing inflammation. It's testing the effect of tocotrienol, which is a type of vitamin E. So one group gets canola oil with tocotrienol, The second group just gets canola oil. In the abstract of the paper, it says there's no significant differences between groups. Well, that means whether or not people got tocotrienol, there was no difference in inflammation between the two groups who both got canola oil. But if you look at the data tables, there absolutely is a statistically significant p-value of 0.048, I'm looking at it, decrease in CRP from week 0, the beginning of the experiment, to week 8 after they had used canola oil for 8 weeks. Now, if before they were given the canola oil, they were using soybean oil, then they would have had a significant drop in linoleic acid consumption over the 8 weeks and a statistically significant drop in CRP levels. But, like I say, there's no standards for what we're presenting in PUFA papers, and so we don't have any baseline data. We don't know if they were eating soybean oil. We just know we just know that they were given canola oil. But luckily, he soon presents another paper also from Iran, interestingly, and that paper might give us a better idea about the baseline diet in Iran.
This other trial compared canola to olive oil, which is considered much better by a lot of people. So it's an interesting comparison. And they actually found a reduction of CRP both on the canola and on olive oil, and no clear difference between the groups.
So this study actually gives us baseline consumption of PUFAs and MUFAs. So that's great. We actually have something to compare it to. And what he says is this study is comparing olive oil to canola oil, and in fact, there is a drop in CRP. But the thing is, there's a third group in this study that he doesn't mention, and that group is given sunflower oil. And we can see the baseline diet. So in this Iranian study, at baseline, so there's a major typo in this data table that we're given. I don't know how these things get through peer review. As I say, none of these are high quality papers. It says total fat is 29.4% of energy. And then it says under PUFA, it says percent of total energy, which sounds like the same thing as 23%. And then saturated fat is 13% and MUFA is 10%. So you add those up, that adds up to 45%. Obviously, 45% is different than 29%. So those numbers can't be right. I think maybe those numbers are grams per day for PUFA, 22 grams a day of PUFA at baseline. It's just a guess. There's no way to tell from this paper. Major typos. So that's another thing to deal with. The first paper from Iran also had major typos in the data section. And so, anyway, so the two groups where he says inflammation went down are the olive oil group. In that group, PUFA consumption goes from 22.7 grams to 6.8 grams per day. So you have a pretty massive drop in PUFA consumption and a decrease in inflammatory numbers that's statistically significant. Second group, canola oil. This group goes from 22.4% of energy as PUFA down to 11.3% of energy as PUFA. Or sorry, I think grams per day, 22 grams to 11 grams per day. So again, that's a pretty significant drop in PUFA consumption, and their CRP levels go down. Now the final group, sunflower oil, the baseline is 19 grams a day. The baseline is 18.3 grams a day. During the dietary trial, they're consuming 19 grams a day. So the same amount of linoleic acid before and after, and they're the only group in which inflammation doesn't drop. And so this study, combined with the previous study, both from Iran, suggests that the baseline Iranian diet is high in either soybean or sunflower oil, probably both, and that if you give people canola oil or olive oil, inflammatory numbers will drop because they're now consuming mufa instead of pufa. I'm not gonna walk through all of these studies, but I'll give you one more. He seems to really like this one. It's reasonably well controlled. They actually did a ton of work, and they even did a 3-day dietary questionnaire at the beginning of the study to collect baseline data on all of the participants, and then they don't report it. So he's talking about what a good, well-done study this is. We have no baseline data. We don't know what the substitutions are. We don't know what the replacements are. We don't know where they are on the S-curve initially. But there are some interesting findings, and I'll talk about it after he talks.
So this trial used the largest dose I've ever seen reported. First, they put all the volunteers on a diet low in omega-6 for a couple weeks to level everybody out. Then they split them into groups and put them on different oils for a month. One group got olive oil, and one got canola, and one got sunflower seed oil. But a huge amount. They were getting almost 500 calories a day from omega-6s alone. 20% of their calories were coming from sunflower seed oil. Just for perspective, most health organizations recommend getting about 5 to 10% of our calories from omega-6s. Ballpark, these guys were getting over 18%. And they found neither an increase nor a decrease in CRP and other inflammatory markers on any of the diets.
So in this study, we don't know what the baseline diet is. But the most interesting thing that happens is they put people on a 2-week low PUFA, high saturated fat diet in the beginning to, quote, as he says, level everyone out. And what happened when they did that? Baseline CRP dropped from an average of about 1.0 among all study participants in the beginning to about 0.7 after that 2-week low PUFA intervention diet. So in just 2 weeks of PUFA restriction, there's a 30% drop in CRP levels. And so, little inconsistencies like this run throughout this whole video if you dig deep into it. But like I say, the basic quality of these studies is so low that it's hard to draw any conclusions. The nutrition community has not taken this issue seriously up until now, and so there haven't been many studies, or really very few studies, that are designed to actually test the question that I'm interested in, which is, as we shifted, starting in 1950 and onwards, as we shifted from a diet that was low in linoleic acid, and then as we changed to like a current American amount of linoleic acid in the diet, what happens then? And interestingly, he introduces just such a paper towards the end of the video. I'm going to get to that. I'm very excited about it. First, we're gonna think about a couple other things that he said, and we're gonna put that all in context before we get to this exciting conclusion, this final video or this final paper.
Linoleic acid is an essential fat. That means our body doesn't produce it. We need to get it from our food. That also means that whatever linoleic acid is in our body came from something we ate, since we can't produce it. So we can measure people's linoleic acid levels in the body and see if that goes in the same direction as the dietary intake data. And what they found was an inverse relationship between circulating levels of omega-6s and inflammatory biomarkers. That means the higher the omega-6 levels in the body, the lower the inflammatory markers.
He makes the correct point, which is that if you have high levels of linoleic acid circulating in your blood, you will have low levels of inflammation. That is a fact. There's no getting around it. This is due to a thing that I mentioned earlier. And so before I say that, he also says that linoleic acid is a biomarker that indicates consumption, how much you ate, right? And looking back over time, if you look in someone's blood and you look at their triglycerides and there's a high amount of linoleic acid, presumably they've been eating more linoleic acid. And that's true. That's absolutely true. There's a study that I really like called Epic Potsdam. This is a long-term study in Germany, and the Epic study is even larger, but there's a great paper about Epic Potsdam and diabetes risk and desaturase activity. And I'll explain in the video what all those things mean. But one of the things, but in this in that paper, what they look at is blood levels of all of these different fats and ratios between them. And what they show is that indeed, the more linoleic acid that you have in your bloodstream, the less likely you are to get diabetes. And of course, everyone who's watching this video's head's exploding because you think that I don't like linoleic acid, and I don't. And how could I say that? And I actually wrote an article on my blog called something along the lines of accumulating linoleic acid prevents diabetes, about just this topic, and you can go back and read that if you want to catch up on the background info. But essentially what they showed, the other thing that they showed in that Epic Potsdam study was how well does linoleic acid predict blood levels? And the answer is not very well. So your diet, so if you look at a general population and you find out how much people are eating, and then you compare it to your blood levels, the dietary levels predicts about 20% of the variation that you see in people's actual blood levels. And so that's not a very good predictor. It's a poor predictor. Conversely, there was a Mendelian randomization study. And humans are hard to study. And so there's this study called Mendelian randomization, and it's a statistical study, and it looks at common genetic variations that people have, and then it also looks at some other factor. So it'll look at like how much linoleic acid is in your blood, and it'll compare it to risk of getting all of these diseases. And through statistical methods, you can get a better idea that okay, this thing might be correlated with that disease outcome or that inflammatory outcome, but it doesn't necessarily cause it. Or this thing is correlated with that and it's likely to be causal. And so when you do Mendelian randomization, you can get an idea that okay, this thing actually causes that thing, right? And so they did this study and they looked at all of these. So there's a whole bunch of diseases that are associated with low levels of linoleic acid. And so this Mendelian randomization study showed that on a population level, when you look at a whole bunch of people, on average in a given area, they usually all on average eat about the same. And so you don't see huge variations in diet typically if you measure enough people. And so in that context, the amount of circulating linoleic acid is largely determined by the enzyme D6D, delta-6 desaturase. In the population at large, delta-6 desaturase is responsible for most of the variation in blood linoleic acid levels. And so what that means is people, on average, in the population, people with more linoleic acid in their blood have fewer oxylipins. And people with less linoleic acid in their blood have more oxylipins. And the activity of delta-6 D6D, delta-6 desaturase, in multiple Mendelian randomization studies has been shown to be causal of diabetes. If you have high D6D activity, you are likely to develop diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, this video is about inflammation, and arthritis is an inflammatory disease. So if you have a high D6D, if you're converting a lot of linoleic acid to oxylipins, you are likely to develop rheumatoid arthritis. And so Gill introduces us to a very interesting paper. And he says, yeah, well, there can be an interaction between linoleic acid and inflammation. Perhaps there are some genetic freaks out there. Perhaps there are some genetic freaks out there who, in their case, if they eat linoleic acid, their inflammation numbers go up.
Okay, so maybe eating seed oils is not inflammatory for most people, but maybe some people have a particular susceptibility. It's like that for most things. Why would this be any different? So there are some genetic studies looking at people with different mutations in that pathway we just looked at that converts linoleic acid to arachidonic acid and beyond. So they put people on a diet high in linoleic acid, and people with one specific mutation, their CRP level trended to increase. So it's possible that there is a subset of people, maybe the more extreme cases, that have a special susceptibility.
And he points us out to this study. And the study is really interesting. It's actually perhaps the best nutrition study I've ever seen. It's remarkable for a bunch of reasons. One is it's done in Finland. And I didn't realize this, but the sunflower oil and soybean oil have had very little penetration into Scandinavian, very far northern European markets. And so if you look at Finland, if you look at Norway, if you look at Denmark, they don't eat much sunflower and soybean oil. They do eat, as I said before, more canola oil. They eat a fair amount of canola oil, but even that, they're simply not gulping down seed oils in the same way that Americans are. And so you have this population with very low baseline linoleic acid consumption, about 10 grams a day. And that's pretty low. That's about as low as you're going to find probably anywhere in the world these days. And so that's really interesting just to start. And by the way, so then that made me wonder, do these Northern European countries have low levels of diabetes? And of course they do. And if you graph out all of Europe, at least all of Western Europe, diabetes levels versus vegetable oil consumption, you can see there's a strong linear correlation. Spain has the highest consumption of sunflower oil. Europe, they don't consume a lot of soybean oil. They mostly consume sunflower oil. Spain has the highest consumption of sunflower oil and among the highest levels of diabetes in Europe, perhaps the highest levels. And the Scandinavian countries are all on the low end, and they all eat low amounts of sunflower oil, and low amounts of soybean oil. And so that is, that doesn't prove anything, but it certainly does not do anything to disprove the idea that vegetable oils are perhaps involved in inflammation and diabetes progress. Anyway, back to the study. So they first off, this delta 6 delta, there are 2 copies that you can get of this gene, right? And so some people have a more active form of delta 6 delta, and that's actually what this poster behind me is. That's the TT form of the gene, and some people have the less active version of the gene, and that is the CC version. And let me try to get out of the way here. So this is the less active version of the gene, is the CC gene. And so you can see delta 6 delta is up here, and I apologize, this graphic sucks. I'm not an artist. And so you have linoleic acid here becoming arachidonic acid, and this arachidonic acid ultimately becomes the oxylipins. And delta 6 delta is the enzyme that is the rate limiting factor in this becoming that. Okay? So delta 6 delta is converting linoleic acid to oxylipins, and there is this variant called RS174550. And you can either have, and so I have two groups of people here. And this is what this is all results from this study. What happens is, right, and when you watch Gil introduce it, it's like, oh, well, there might be a few extreme cases of genetic freaks that have an increase of inflammation in response to eating more seed oils or eating more linoleic acid. And in fact, there are, and so that's over here. That's the CC genotype. And so, interestingly, people with a CC genotype these are the ones that are protected against diabetes. They have a low delta 6 delta activity level, which means they have high linoleic acid in their blood. They have low oxylipins because they're not converting this to this, because this enzyme is going slowly, right? And so since they're not making these oxylipins, they have a low diabetes risk. But interestingly, also, this is not a small percentage. This is about 20% of the people. This is about one person out of 5 has these good genes and are going to be protected from diabetes because they're not making oxylipins, right? And interestingly, those are the people who, if you give them, and they did this in the study, they gave them, so what they do in the study is they take these people from Finland who are on they're getting about 10 grams of linoleic acid a day, and then they, I think triple, they go up to 30, I think at the end it's 31 grams of linoleic acid a day. And like I say, in the American diet, we're consuming maybe, I don't know, call it 45 grams a day. That's about 3 tablespoons of soybean oil on average. That's about 50% linoleic acid. So just from the soybean oil alone in the American diet, you have 20 plus grams of linoleic acid. But then, we also have some sunflower seed oil here and there and some canola oil here and there. And our chicken can be 35% linoleic acid. Pork fat in the U.S. is typically 15-16% linoleic acid. And so their final ending number of around 30 grams a day of linoleic acid is probably pretty close to what I would say the American diet, the normal American diet is, right? And so, interestingly, this group with the good genetics that are protected from diabetes, 1 out of every 5 people, their inflammation levels go up significantly when their levels of linoleic acid go from this very low Finland level to an American level. Okay? So get that in your head. The ones who genetically are protected from diabetes are the same ones whose inflammation levels go up if they increase omega-6 consumption. Now, here's the other group, TT, right? And so CC and TT, what that means is, this C is one version of the gene, T is the other version of the gene. And so the C is the more active. And as you know, we have 2 copies of every gene. So 1 out of 5 people have 2 copies of the good gene, the less active version of D6D, which means if you have 2 good copies of the genes, you'll convert less linoleic acid to oxylipins. Over here, these guys have 2 bad copies, right? And that's about 1 out of 3 people in Finland in this study. And I looked it up, by the way. There's a study about the Chinese Han, and in them, something like 42% of people have the bad copy of the gene. So, when he talks about the genetic freaks, these people who are okay, and so the TT over here are more likely, they have a more active D6D. So they convert more linoleic acid via D6D to oxylipins. And so those TT people are likely to develop diabetes. They have high oxylipins. They have low linoleic acid, right? That's how it works. And in those people, when you give them linoleic acid, their CRP levels go down. So in the people that are most likely to get diabetes, if you give them linoleic acid, their CRP levels drop. So if you give someone more linoleic acid, more soybean oil, more sunflower seed oil, and their inflammatory numbers drop, that's actually a very bad thing. That suggests that you're one of the 1 out of 3 people, or the 42% of people, if you're a Chinese Han, that have 2 bad copies of the D6D gene, which in multiple Mendelian randomization studies has been shown to be associated with diabetes, heart disease, rheumatoid arthritis. These studies have been done in men, women, children. They've been done in Japan, America, worldwide, right? And so having a high activity of this gene is very bad. It means you're going to make a lot of oxylipins. You're going to be likely to get diabetes. But if you eat a bunch of soybean oil, your CRP levels will go down. And so this study is throwing a gigantic curveball into the thesis of the video that we're talking about, because the fact is, if you increase people's linoleic acid levels, and some people, CRP is going to go up, inflammation is going to go up. Some people, inflammation is going to go down. But low inflammation in this case is bad, and high inflammation in this case is good. So now think about the thesis of the video. Are seed oils inflammatory? Well, it's sort of complicated, isn't it? And so then that begs the question. So then, okay, but what about the other half of all the people, right? 1 out of 5 is over here. 1 out of 3 is over here. Then about half of the people are in the middle. They have 1 copy of this gene. They have 1 copy of the bad gene. And so they're going to have some intermediate risk between the 2 groups. And we don't really know, if you look at their linoleic acid levels, they're kind of right in the middle of the 2. And so 80% of the people do not have 2 good copies of this gene. 80% of the people are not protected against diabetes, is what I would say. So in 80% of people, there is some risk that you're converting a lot of linoleic acid to oxylipins via high D6D activity levels. D6D activity levels cause diabetes. They cause rheumatoid arthritis, which is an inflammatory disease. Now, the study gets even better. It just keeps on giving. So like I was saying, if you take the people with the good genes, with low D6D activity, on their baseline diet, which is very low in linoleic acid, only about 10 grams a day, they have low levels of oxylipins. If you look at the people with the TT genetics, on their baseline diet, also only 10 grams of linoleic acid a day, they have much higher levels of oxylipins. But when you increase the amount of linoleic acid in the diet from 10 grams to 30 grams, the amount of oxylipins in both groups goes up substantially. And in fact, even with the good genes, when you go from 10 grams of linoleic acid to 30 grams of linoleic acid, even the people with the good genes end up with higher levels of oxylipins than the people with the bad genes at 10 grams of intake. And of course, people with the bad genes at 30 grams of linoleic acid have the highest level of oxylipins. And so you can see in the paper talks about this effect of genes and diet, and they're both acting together. So the copy of the gene that you have affects how much linoleic acid is converted to oxylipins, and the amount of linoleic acid that you consume affects how much linoleic acid is converted to oxylipins. And I just want to expound on this a little bit more because I know people on the other side of the argument will watch this video and say, you can't talk about D6D, that's a genetic thing. It doesn't have anything to do with diet. But, as I just explained, it's the whole reason. I mean, D6D only does one thing. It just starts this process of converting linoleic acid to oxylipins. That's its whole job. And we know that people that have high D6D activity have more oxylipins. And we know that people with high D6D activity are more likely to get diabetes and are more likely to get rheumatoid arthritis. And so, what other reason could D6D be causing diabetes than the fact that it's making more arachidonic acid and more oxylipins? Like, that's all it does. It just has one job. And so, one way to make it go faster is to have the wrong genes. But the other way to make it go faster is to eat more linoleic acid. And so, critics will say, this my video was about diet, and you're talking about an enzyme and a genetic thing, but they work together. One way to increase throughput through D6D is to eat more linoleic acid. And that is why this genetic thing, this gene variant, is so interesting, because it tells us so much about, again, I showed that clip in the video where he says, in fact, none of us have any idea what these things will do on our metabolism in general. But in fact, we know very well that if we're making more of these, we're more likely to get diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. So one of my favorite parts of this video is this clip.
Or if you deep fry the oil repeatedly, right, over and over, I think that's what they do in some of these fast food restaurants.
What this clip tells me is that Gil has never worked in a restaurant kitchen. Everyone who's worked in a restaurant kitchen knows he's minimizing this issue of reheated fryer oil, right? Oil that is heated over and over and over again. And he basically says, if you watch the whole video, he says there's really not much evidence about it, right? Like, it's never really been tested in humans. I can tell you that there are all kinds of animal experience using reheated fryer oil with really bad results. I'm very interested in the history of obesity. There's a very interesting, fairly recent one where they take rabbits and they give them either 1% fresh soybean oil or 1% oil that's been heated and reheated and reheated and reheated and reheated and reheated. And the rabbits that get the reheated oil or the multiply reheated oil, they become obese compared to the normal rabbits, but they actually eat less. So it's less calories, more fatter, due to the reheated fryer oil. And like I say, my blog is not about inflammation. It's about effects of these vegetable oils and seed oils on lipid metabolism. And so fryer oils have a very interesting, one of the interesting things about fryer oil is they clearly increase activity level of a gene called PPAR alpha, one of these nuclear receptors that I think I already mentioned, but and probably also PPAR gamma, and probably also the arrow hydrocarbon receptor, and that is affecting your basic metabolism, right? They're doing all kinds of things. He thinks this is what, quote, some fast food restaurants do, but in fact, this happens in literally every restaurant that you've ever been to. Restaurants do not change the seed oil daily, and I'll tell you what else happens. If on a restaurant fryer, when you turn it to off, it's not really off. The oil just goes down to like 200 degrees overnight. And that's just convenient for the restaurant because like when the fry cook comes in the next morning, hungover at 10:45, and he has to start serving at 11, he's going to flip that thing back up to 350, and it's a lot faster to go from 200 to 350 than it is from room temperature all the way up to 350, so that he can get those first orders when they come out at 11:05, right? And so as a convenience, oil in restaurant fryers is hot all the time. It's hotter during service, right? But the whole time it's heated. And, a tank of fryer oil in the smallest fryers costs about $50. And, it takes an hour or two, maybe 2 hours to clean out the fryer. And if you're paying somebody $15 an hour to clean out the fryer, the cost to change the fryer oil is $80 at least, and then there's taxes and fees on top of that, $15 an hour, so it's probably closer to $100. And then you have a disposal issue because now you have all these jugs of hot oil, and hot. What are you doing with them, right? And so there's all kinds of reasons why restaurants don't replace their fryer oil all the time. I mean, could you imagine? So if it really costs $100 a day, if a small restaurant swap their oil out every day, well, that's $30,000 a year, just to change that fryer oil, right? And so restaurants don't do it. And so I know this, being in the restaurant industry, but I actually looked it up, and there's actually papers. This is a paper. It's from Spain, and you can see, like I say, in Spain, all of the fryers have sunflower oil in them. In America, it's all soybean oil, although they also sell jugs of canola oil. You can look them up in your Cisco catalog, right? And so they asked fry cooks in Spain, and these were from large food service organizations that run cafeterias. So school cafeterias, corporate cafeterias, hospital cafeterias. These are large companies. Some of them were operating like 1,100 cafeterias. And so they contacted HR or whatever, and they sent these questionnaires to the fry cooks, and they said, how often in your cafeteria, what is the policy for how often you change the fryer oil? And and the results are great, and it was just what I knew it would be. But basically the results are like every 2 weeks, once a month, every 2 months, some of them said, and then a lot of them were no defined frequency, just kind of like whenever. We change the fryer oil whenever. So, and then there's a separate table where they asked them, well, when was the last time you changed the fryer oil? And some of them were like 5 weeks ago. And so this oil, when you go to, your kids at school, when you go to a restaurant, any restaurant, the nice French bistro down the street, that oil, everybody uses sunflower. So we right. So we just put straight sun. We used to have hydrogenated oils in the fryers. I'm not a fan of trans fats. I'm not arguing for them, but they're much more stable in the fryers, and they don't break down as quickly. And chemists in the 60s knew that, and that's why they said, well, if you're going to put this into a deep fryer, you should use the hydrogenated oil, not straight soybean oil. But now we outlawed those, and we didn't really come up with a good replacement. And so now restaurants are just putting straight soybean oil in their fryers and let them rip for 5 weeks. So when you go in for dinner and order those fries, some of that oil has been continuously heated for a month, right? And so I pulled a couple papers about how fast do these oils break down, and you can see, and I like this one because it shows that beef tallow is the standard, right? It's the standard, and you can see, so in this first graph, this is really hot. This is about 400 degrees. That's hotter than most fryers run. But you can see that, so we have these standards called the polar fraction of the oil. So oils break down to things called aldehydes. Basically, they oxidize. The double bonds are sources of oxidative damage. And that causes the fryer oil to break down in all these aldehydes like nonanol and hexanol and all these other things. And another thing they can do is they can polymerize. So if you have a triglyceride that has like 3 chains of fats on it, right, attached to a glycerol molecule, and they can cross-link. And so then what happens if you have one triglyceride attached to another triglyceride, attached to another triglyceride, and that's it's kind of like linoleum or something, right? And so you have these polymerized oils, and then you have these oils that are breaking down into all these aldehydes and other oxidized things, and I'm sure they make hundreds of different molecules, and we probably don't even know what a lot of them are. And so when they look at these fryer oils, after a week, some of them are at like 20% of the volume of the fryer oil are these aldehydes, and another 20% might be these polymers. And so when you go into that restaurant, if you look at this chart, like the beef tallow holds out the longest versus, and this one is at regular. So when we looked at the soybean oil versus beef tallow at 400 degrees, the soybean oil hits like 30% of polar molecules in like 3 or 4 days, right? So by the end of the week, it's toast at 400 degrees. But even at 350, all of these oils are breaking down faster than beef tallow, which is the old standard. And those other lines that are basically running parallel right with the beef tallow, those are partially hydrogenated oils. And so those are the oils that used to be in fryers. And again, I'm not arguing in favor of trans fats. I'm not. I'm just saying that there's a reason why we made trans fats in the first place, and it's because vegetable oils are unstable, and it's a bad idea to fry with them. And so anyway, so you can see how much more stable the beef tallow is than these vegetable oils. And so here's another paper that I really like, and what it's showing that you can see the lines on these graphs. So one of the things is it's showing they heat oil for up to 50 hours, right, at deep frying temperatures. So that's a pretty good test, right? They did this for a while. And what happens is those 2 lines on the bottom are the saturated fat and the monounsaturated fat. And so this is soybean oil, so it contains some saturated fat and it contains some monounsaturated fat. And you can see those lines are flat, right? Those fats aren't really breaking down over time. The line that is descending over time, well, that's the polyunsaturated fats. The polyunsaturated fats are the ones that are breaking down in the deep fryer of soybean oil over the 50 hours. And that line that's rising, that is one of the aldehydes. It's a particularly common one, and it's not the right-hand axis is the amount of the aldehyde. So at the end of the experiment, the aldehyde is up to 0.5% of all of the oil. And like I said, that aldehyde is 1 out of maybe 200. So, if the soybean oil goes from 55% linoleic acid down to 35% linoleic acid, that suggests that 20% of that oil is aldehydes and oxidized oils. And that is what we are all eating all of the time. And we haven't done any studies in humans, so we don't know the effects. So, next time when you go to a restaurant, think about this before you order those French fries.